David.
Thanks, David. Well, we're going to bring in Fox News foreign correspondent Trey Yingst. He's live from the Middle East. Trey, tell us the latest.
There's a lot of questions right now about what happens in Kabul amid reports that the Taliban has entered the outskirts of the city and is currently meeting with top officials trying to figure out some sort of transition of power. I think the good news right now for the region is that we have not seen the violence that many feared would happen when the Taliban entered the Afghan capital. Over the past 8 days, we saw this group take over 31 of the 34 provincial capitals across the country. And there were these scenes of fighting between Afghan security forces and the insurgents. But now it appears like some political solution could come out of the situation in Kabul, only to avoid what could be some sort of mass casualty situation. Over the past several days, there were these questions about what would happen to Afghan President Ashraf Ghani if the Taliban actually made it to Kabul. And now that we see this situation unfolding, you have peace negotiators in Qatar meeting with Taliban officials there, trying to send this message that they want to have some sort of peaceful transition of power. We do want to note, though, the Bagram Air Base news that is coming out, David reporting on that just a few minutes ago, is extremely concerning to the Afghan civilian population, because we're talking about thousands of Taliban prisoners that are considered criminals and, in some cases, extremely dangerous people inside Afghanistan. And when you talk about freeing many of these insurgents, it's not only going to allow the Taliban to reinforce their ranks, but also exert this force and fear among the population. And that is the major concern. What happens when these U.S. troops are able to get the embassy personnel out of the country? What is left behind? That's the big question this morning.
Yeah, judging from the video that we're seeing, Trey, the answer to that question is something very bad, as we see traffic jams with people trying to leave Kabul. It seems to be their interpretation of those 5,000 American troops isn't going to be there to help them in any way. What about all the people that helped us, Trey? What about all the interpreters, the thousands of people who aided the American troops throughout the last 2 decades? What happens to them?
Well, I think there was a hope by this administration, the Biden administration, that they would be able to help these interpreters and these translators who will be targets for the Taliban to get out on time. Everyone caught on their heels, though. We saw just a few days ago, the U.S. intelligence community, their assessment of the situation was that Kabul could fall in 90 days. That turned into 30 days and then just 72 hours. When they saw the second and third largest cities in Afghanistan, Herat and Kandahar, fall, those were major indicators the Taliban was rapidly advancing towards Kabul. And now what happens to these U.S. allies who were with U.S. troops following 9/11, this 20-year war? A lot of people along the way helping those American forces, and even the drawdown. We still saw many Afghan civilians and professionals trying to help the Americans conduct their mission and ultimately draw down the force presence there in Afghanistan. There is a program right now. It's a special immigrant visa program that the United States is offering to many of those U.S. allies on the ground. But reports indicate there are upwards of 80,000 applicants, and only 1 or 2% of them have actually been flown out of the country. So we're seeing these images in Kabul of streets filled with people, cars blocked in traffic jams, and many heading to the airport hoping they can find a way out of Afghanistan before the Taliban formally takes over. We've seen a lot of statements from Taliban officials that they are not going to target civilians or those who have worked with the Afghan security forces or U.S. military, but that's all fine to say on paper and it's fine to put out in statements. But what actually happens on the ground is likely to be far different. Overnight, I spoke with a member of the Taliban who works along the media wing of the organization, and that official said that there was no consensus in the conversations between the Afghan government and the Taliban over the conversations taking place in Qatar over the past several months. And ultimately, the one phrase that spokesperson used was an Islamic system. That really gets to the core of what the Taliban is looking to do here. They are looking to implement an Islamic system, and that means very bad news for the civilian population in Afghanistan, particularly women.
So, Trey, I want to pick up right where you left off because it's such a critical question. Let's talk about the people of Afghanistan. Let's talk about the Taliban. They plan on imposing Sharia. They're Sunni Islamists. Are the people resisting, or are they buckling to the Taliban's rule?
It depends on what part of Afghanistan we're talking about. Many of these provincial capitals, you saw the Taliban simply walk into the city and take over. There were no firefights in many of these areas in Afghanistan, and that is in part because they do have support in many parts of the country. There is this growing frustration among the civilian population in Afghanistan about the current government that is about to be replaced by the Taliban, but there's also a very large percentage of the population that has lived in a westernized society. We saw Olympians, we saw scientists, doctors, some of the brightest minds in the world coming out of Afghanistan. Women who previously, when Afghanistan was under Taliban rule, had to constantly cover their hair, in many areas cover their faces. They weren't allowed to work, they weren't allowed to study. That is the major concern for this population, and we've already seen it according to reports in some of the western provinces that were taken over earlier by the Taliban. Officials walked in and said to women they could no longer work at the bank. They could no longer study unless it was a religious-based study on the Quran. And that's extremely concerning to this population that understands what is out there. They understand the opportunity is there. And now the Taliban, just hours away, it appears, from taking control in Afghanistan, going to take away many of those rights and freedoms for the Afghan people.
Yeah, it's devastating. We've heard of, the Taliban coming in and just stealing, 12-year-old girls and putting them into forced marriages. It's just devastating. I've also heard of other atrocities and war crimes and the beheadings of some of the national forces. So hopefully things won't continue to spiral in that direction.
We'll check in with you a little bit later in the show. Trey, thank you so much for that update.